waypoint. The math was flawless. The physics were iron. Every single species in the Galactic Council had tried it and failed. So when the Xylo's ambassador asked me, with genuine pity in his 4 compound eyes, why we were even attempting the Void Corridor, I looked at my crew and laughed. Not because I was brave, because humans have this stupid, beautiful habit of looking at certain death and saying, yeah, but what if we didn't? Commander Elias Vance had been awake for 37 hours when the Xylo's delegation finally stopped laughing. They weren't being cruel. That was the strange part. The Xylos were old, older than most species in the Council by several million years, and they had earned their reputation as patient, methodical thinkers. When they laughed, it was the slow, clicking sound of genuine surprise, like watching a child insist they could lift a mountain with their bare hands. You misunderstand the nature of the corridor, said Ambassador Thrix, his mandibles twitching in what Elias had learned was the equivalent of a gentle smile. It is not a challenge to be overcome through willpower. It is a fundamental rupture in space-time. Your ship would be compressed, stretched, and irradiated beyond any known material's tolerance. Even our oldest vessels cannot survive. Elias leaned back in the diplomatic chair, which had been designed for a species with 3 pelvic joints and was therefore deeply uncomfortable for a human spine. He didn't complain. Complaining would have been undignified, and right now, dignity was the only currency humans had in this room. The Council has run the simulations, Thrix continued, his translator unit humming softly. 7,432 attempts over the last 12,000 cycles. Not a single success. The corridor does not yield to technology, strategy, or desperation. It simply kills. Elias nodded slowly. He had read the reports. He had memorized the casualty figures. He had also noticed something none of the other species seemed to have considered. Ambassador, he said, keeping his voice calm, how many of those attempts were made by species who knew, going in, that they would probably die? Thrix's compound eyes flickered. All of them, Commander. Survival is the primary objective of any sentient species. No, Elias said, shaking his head. There's a difference between knowing you might die and knowing you will die. Your crews went in hoping to survive. That means they spent their energy trying not to die. That changes how you fly, how you think. The silence that followed was so complete that Elias could hear the faint hum of the ship's life support system through the bulkhead. Thrix's mandibles stopped moving entirely. You are suggesting, the ambassador said slowly, that your crew would enter the corridor expecting death? I'm suggesting we don't care about the odds. Elias stood up, his knees popping audibly in the quiet room. That's our thing. The more impossible something looks, the more likely a human is to try it. Not because we're stupid, because we've learned that impossible usually means nobody's been desperate enough yet. Thrix's translator clicked twice, which Elias had learned meant the ambassador was recalculating something in his mind. It was a strange thing to witness, a creature so ancient, so wise, suddenly realizing that its framework for understanding the universe might have a blind spot. The Council will not authorize this mission, Thrix said finally. We cannot sanction suicide. We're not asking for authorization. Elias walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the activation plate. We're asking for the navigation data. The real data, not the sanitized version you gave the other species. Thrix's eyes dimmed slightly, a sign of distress, according to the cultural handbook Elias had studied during the long voyage to this station. That data is classified. It contains the exact radiation frequencies, the spatial distortion patterns, the things you've been hiding because you were afraid someone might actually use them, Elias interrupted. Yeah, I know. He turned back to face the ambassador, and for the first time in their week of negotiations, he let the mask slip. Just a little. Just enough for Thrix to see what was underneath the calm, professional exterior. There are 300,000 people on Kessler Station, Elias said quietly. They've been drifting in the debris field for 6 months. Their oxygen runs out in 11 days. The corridor is the only path that gets us there in time. So you can give us the data, or you can watch us fly blind. Either way, we're going. Thrix's translator produced a sound Elias had never heard before, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the deck plates. It took him a moment to realize it was laughter. Not mocking laughter. Something else. Something almost like recognition. "You are remarkable creatures," Thrix said. "I have studied 217 sentient species over my lifespan. None of them have ever argued with math." "Math doesn't have anything to say about stubbornness," Elias replied. "Now are you going to help us or not?" The ambassador's mandibles opened wide, a gesture of surrender, Elias recalled. "I will provide the data, but I will also file a formal objection with the Council, noting that I believe this mission will result in the death of every human on board." "Noted." Elias stepped through the door, then stuck his head back in. "One more thing, Ambassador. When we make it through, and we will make it through, you might want to update those simulations. Because the math isn't wrong. It's just incomplete." Thrix watched the human leave, his ancient mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. These creatures had barely achieved interstellar travel. Their bodies were fragile, their technology was crude, and their understanding of physics was, by galactic standards, embarrassingly primitive. And yet, the ambassador turned to his console and began transmitting the classified navigation data. He also, without fully understanding why, began recording the entire conversation for the Council's archives. He had a feeling that future generations would want to study this moment. The moment when everything changed. The void corridor stretched across 22 light-years of absolute nothingness. That wasn't hyperbole. The region of space had been hollowed out by some ancient catastrophe, a supernova, a black hole merger, or perhaps something even older and stranger, leaving behind a tunnel of distorted space-time where the normal rules of physics simply didn't apply. Every species that had attempted the crossing had reported similar experiences. The first few light years were manageable, if terrifying. The ship would shake, the radiation levels would spike, and the crew would feel a creeping sense of wrongness that no amount of training could prepare them for. But the real trouble started around the halfway point, when the spatial distortions became severe enough to tear apart molecular bonds. The Xylos had lost their best ship at the 7-light-year mark. The crew had reported, in their final transmission, that the walls of the ship had begun to ripple like water, and then there was nothing but static. Lieutenant Maya, she knew all of this. She had memorized every failure report, every telemetry recording, every last word spoken by the crews who had come before. She had also, without telling anyone, written a goodbye message to her parents and stored it in the ship's black box. "We're approaching the threshold," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. 30 seconds to entry. Commander Vance stood behind her, one hand resting on the back of her chair. His face was calm, but Maya could see the tightness around his eyes. He was scared too. They all were. "Bring up the distortion map," Vance said. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The main view screen flickered, displaying a three-dimensional visualization of the corridor. It looked like a tangled knot of threads, each thread representing a different type of spatial anomaly. The Xylos had color-coded them by severity: green for mild, yellow for moderate, red for severe. The map was almost entirely red. "Damn," whispered Ensign Takeda from the navigation station. "That's a lot of red." "Yeah," Vance agreed. "But look here." He stepped forward and pointed at a narrow channel near the corridor's outer edge. "This section is mostly yellow. If we hug the boundary, we might avoid the worst of it." Maya zoomed in on the channel. "That's a 20% longer route," she said. "Our radiation shielding won't last that long. It will if we push the reactor to 120%. The reactor isn't rated for, I know what's rated for." Vance's voice was gentle but firm. "But the reactor doesn't know it's supposed to fail. It just follows the laws of physics. And the laws of physics don't say we can't push harder. They just say there will be consequences." Maya stared at him for a long moment. This was the thing about Commander Vance that no report could capture. He didn't think like an engineer. He didn't think like a soldier. He thought like a human who had spent his entire life being told that something was impossible, only to discover that impossible was just a word people used when they were too tired to try. 120% it is, she said. The ship shuddered as it crossed the threshold. For the first few hours, the corridor was almost peaceful. The stars outside the viewport stretched into long, thin lines, then curled into spirals, then dissolved into a swirling fog of light and shadow. The distortion alarms remained silent. The radiation level stayed within acceptable parameters. Maya almost allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the Xylos had been wrong. Then they hit the first red zone. The ship lurched violently, throwing everyone against their restraints. Alarms blared. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the harsh red glow of emergency systems. Maya's hands flew across her console, rerouting power, compensating for the sudden surge of radiation, trying to keep the ship from tearing itself apart. Hull integrity at 80%, she shouted over the noise. Radiation level spiking. We're losing the forward shielding. Keep us on course, Vance said, his voice unnaturally calm. Takeda, give me a route through the next 3 red zones. I don't care how long it takes. Takeda's fingers moved so fast they blurred. I found a path, sir, but it'll add another 4 hours to the crossing. The shielding won't last 4 more hours, Maya said. It will if we cycle it, Vance replied. Take power from life support. Redirect it to the forward arrays. Sir, if we cut life support, we won't cut it. We'll cycle it. 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off. The crew can handle brief exposure to vacuum conditions. We've trained for this. Maya opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. He was right. They had trained for this. Every human on board had spent weeks in vacuum chambers, learning to hold their breath, to conserve oxygen, to function under conditions that would have killed any other species. She rerouted the power. The shields flared back to life just as another distortion wave hit the ship. The next 8 hours were a nightmare. The ship groaned and screamed like a living thing in pain. The crew worked in shifts, rotating between their stations and the emergency oxygen lockers, their bodies adapting to the constant cycling of atmosphere and vacuum. Someone threw up. Someone else started crying and then stopped ashamed. Vance moved through the ship, checking on everyone, offering quiet words of encouragement, making sure nobody gave up. At hour 6, the main reactor began to overheat. The cooling systems had been damaged by a radiation spike, and the temperature was rising faster than the emergency backups could handle. Maya ran the numbers 3 times, hoping for a different answer, but the math was merciless. Commander, she said, her voice hollow, if we don't shut down the reactor in the next 15 minutes, it's going to melt down. Vance walked over to her console and studied the readings. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, but his eyes were sharp and focused. What if we vent the excess heat into the corridor? He asked. That's insane. The spatial distortions would what? Scatter it? Absorb it? I don't care. I just need a place to put the heat that isn't inside my ship. Maya stared at him. Then she started laughing. It was the kind of laughter that came from exhaustion and terror and the sheer absurdity of the situation. You want to use the void corridor as a heat sink, she said. I want to try. She ran the simulation. The numbers were ugly. The heat would indeed be scattered by the spatial distortions, but the process would create feedback loops that might tear the ship apart. The probability of survival was less than 5%. But that wasn't the right question. The right question was, could it be done? Yes, Maya said. It's possible. Do it. She opened the emergency vents. Superheated plasma streamed out of the ship's cooling towers, directly into the swirling chaos of the corridor. The space around them lit up like a star going supernova. The ship shook so hard that Maya felt her teeth rattle in her skull. And then, slowly, the temperature began to drop. The reactor stabilized at 92% of maximum tolerance. The shields held. The crew kept breathing, cycling in and out of vacuum, their bodies pushed to the edge of what human physiology could endure. At hour 9, the corridor began to thin. The stars outside the viewport stopped swirling. The fog of light and shadow started to clear. The distortion alarms fell silent, one by one, until there was nothing but the steady hum of the reactor and the quiet sobbing of relief from the crew. Maya checked the navigation data. They were 3 light years from the exit. "We're going to make it," she whispered. Vance put a hand on her shoulder. His grip was warm and solid, grounding her in a way that no amount of training could have prepared her for. "Of course we are," he said. "The odds were terrible. That's when we do our best work." Ambassador Thrix received the transmission at exactly 0347 station time. He had been sitting in his quarters, reviewing the latest reports from Kessler's station, which predicted that the human colony would run out of oxygen in approximately 4 days. The Council had already drafted the official condolence message. It was a formality at this point. The transmission was flagged as Priority Alpha, the highest possible designation. Thrix opened it with a sense of dread. He expected it to be the final words of Commander Vance, a last testament to the folly of human stubbornness. Instead, he saw a human face. Not Vance's face. A younger woman with dark hair and exhausted eyes. Behind her, through the viewport of her ship, Thrix could see the familiar contours of the Kessler debris field. "This is Lieutenant Maya Chun of the Earth vessel Perseverance," she said. "We have successfully transited the Void Corridor and are currently in orbit around Kessler Station. We are preparing to begin evacuation procedures. Repeat, we have made it through. The corridor is passable." Thrix watched the message 3 times. Then, he transmitted it to the full council without comment. The response was immediate. Within an hour, every species in the galaxy was demanding answers. How had the humans done it? What technology had they used? What secret had they discovered that had eluded the greatest minds of the Council for 12,000 cycles? Thrix didn't have answers, so he did something unprecedented. He requested a private meeting with Commander Vance. They met on the Council station in the same diplomatic room where their first conversation had taken place. Vance looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes were sunken, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been pushed far beyond its limits. But he was smiling. "You look surprised, Ambassador," Vance said, lowering himself into the uncomfortable chair with a grunt of pain. "I am," Thrix admitted. "I watched your transit data. Your ship was subjected to forces that should have reduced it to subatomic particles. Your crew experienced radiation doses that should have caused immediate cellular death. And yet here you are, alive. Mostly alive," Vance corrected. "We lost 2 people, Ensign Takeda and Petty Officer Rodriguez. The radiation got them about an hour before we cleared the corridor." Thrix's mandibles twitched in what might have been sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Vance's smile faded. "But here's the thing, Ambassador. We knew we would lose people. We planned for it. We talked about it before we left. Every single person on that ship volunteered, knowing there was a good chance they wouldn't come back. And they went anyway. Why?" It was the question that had been haunting Thrix since he first laid eyes on the human species. Why did they do the things they did? Why did they keep trying, even when failure was guaranteed? Why did they value the lives of strangers more than their own? Vance was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle. "Because that's what we do," he said. "We look at something that seems impossible, and we try it anyway. Not because we're brave, not because we're stupid, because we've learned that the universe doesn't care about our math or our simulations or our carefully calculated odds. The universe only cares about what actually happens." He leaned forward, his tired eyes locking onto Thrix's compound gaze. "You asked me once why humans are so stubborn. The answer is that we've failed more times than any species in the galaxy. We've failed so many times that failure doesn't scare us anymore. We've learned that failure isn't the end. It's just data. It's just another way that didn't work, which brings us one step closer to the way that does." Thrix sat in silence, processing this information. He thought about the 7,432 attempts that had come before. He thought about the crews who had entered the corridor hoping to survive, and the crews who had died when their hope ran out. He thought about the Council's simulations, which had predicted certain death for the humans and about the humans themselves who had ignored those predictions and done the impossible anyway. You are saying, Thrix said slowly, that your species' greatest strength is not endurance or creativity or even stubbornness. It is your relationship with failure. Vance blinked. Then he laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. I never thought of it that way, he admitted. But yeah, I guess that's right. We don't see failure as something to avoid. We see it as something to learn from. Every time we fall down, we get back up and try something different. Eventually, we figure it out. Eventually, Thrix repeated. But in this case, eventually was not an option. You had 11 days. Your colony was dying. Why did you not simply accept the inevitable and prepare for the loss? Vance's smile disappeared. His eyes hardened, and for a moment, Thrix saw something flicker behind them, something ancient and fierce and utterly terrifying. Because those are our people, Vance said quietly. 300,000 human beings, sitting in a debris field, waiting to die. And we had a ship, and we had a path, and we had a chance no matter how small. So we took it, because that's what you do. You don't abandon your people. You don't leave them to die alone. You go, even if it kills you, especially if it kills you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Thrix realized, with a clarity that shocked him, that he had been looking at humanity all wrong. He had seen them as fragile, primitive, strange. He had pitted them for their short lifespans and their weak bodies and their desperate, clinging hope. But he had missed the point. The fragility was the point. The weakness was the point. Humans didn't succeed despite their limitations. They succeeded because of them. They had nothing to lose. They had everything to gain. And they had learned through millennia of failure and suffering and loss that the only thing that mattered was trying. Commander Vance, Thrix said, his translator humming softly, I believe I owe you an apology. For what? For underestimating you. The ambassador's mandibles opened wide. The Xylo's gesture of respect, not surrender. Your species is not weak. You're the strongest species I have ever encountered. Because you have mastered the one thing that the rest of us cannot understand. What's that? Thrix leaned forward, his ancient eyes reflecting the human's tired, determined face. You have learned how to win when winning is impossible. Vance smiled. It was a tired smile worn thin by grief and exhaustion, but there was something else in it too. Something that looked like hope. We're still learning, he said. But yeah, that's the idea. Outside the diplomatic room, the council was already meeting in emergency session. The humans had done the impossible, and now every species in the galaxy was scrambling to understand how. Ships were being refitted. Strategies were being rewritten. Alliances were being reconsidered. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. And somewhere in the debris field around Kessler Station, 300,000 people were breathing air that should have run out days ago. Breathing because a group of humans had looked at certain death and said, not today. The more impossible the odds, the more humans succeed. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a threat. It was just a fact. And now every species in the galaxy knew it. The council chambers fell silent as Ambassador Thrix entered and took his seat. The other ambassadors turned to him, their various eyes filled with questions he wasn't sure he could answer. The humans, said the Vel ambassador, her crystalline voice sharp with demand, explain how they did it. Thrix considered his response carefully. He could talk about the reactor modifications, the radiation cycling, the navigation path that hugged the corridor's edge. He could explain the engineering and the physics and the cold, hard math of survival. But that wasn't the real answer. The real answer was something else entirely. They did it, Thrix said slowly, because they refused to accept that it couldn't be done. The council waited for more. Thrix offered nothing else, because he understood now that some things couldn't be explained. They could only be witnessed. And somewhere on a battered ship called Perseverance, Commander Elias Vance closed his eyes and finally slept.